The snow is stained red. British commandos lie wounded in a Norwegian fishing village, surrounded by Wehrmacht soldiers. The SS has issued explicit orders: execute all captured raiders immediately. But the German commander standing over these men is about to make a decision that could cost him everything. He's going to let them escape. And this story reveals a moral divide within the German military that the Nazis tried desperately to hide. What you're about to hear isn't a Hollywood fantasy. It's documented history that exposes the brutal conflict between the Wehrmacht's old officer code and the SS's ideology of total war. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of Operation Archery and the raids that followed, hit subscribe and like the video. By the end, you'll understand why some German officers risked execution themselves rather than become murderers, and why this moral complexity matters more today than ever. This is the story of December 27th, 1941, when British commandos struck the Norwegian coast in one of the war's most daring raids, and how the aftermath revealed a fracture in the German military that would widen into a chasm. It's a story about courage on both sides, about the limits of obedience, and about men who chose honor over orders even when it meant signing their own death warrants. To understand what happened on that frozen Norwegian shore, we need to go back 6 months earlier to a moment when Adolf Hitler made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of the war. May 1941. Hitler's armies have conquered most of Europe. France has fallen in a humiliating 6-week campaign. The Low Countries are occupied. Denmark and Norway are under German control. The Wehrmacht seems invincible, a modern military machine that has rewritten the rules of warfare with its blitzkrieg tactics. But Britain refuses to surrender. Despite being driven from the continent at Dunkirk, despite the Blitz raining bombs on London night after night, Winston Churchill's government fights on. And Churchill has a problem that goes beyond military strategy. British morale is suffering. The army hasn't won a significant victory since the war began. The public needs to see that Britain can strike back, that the fight isn't hopeless, that German-occupied Europe isn't an impregnable fortress. Churchill's solution is radical: create specialized units trained for lightning raids on occupied Europe, hit hard, disappear fast, and prove to both the British public and the Germans that nowhere is safe. These units become known as the Commandos, and their motto is simple: strike and strike again. The man Churchill chooses to lead this new force is Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, but the operational commanders who will make the Commandos legendary are men like Lord Lovat, John Durnford Slater, and Charles Newman. These are officers who understand that this new kind of warfare requires a new kind of soldier, not just physically tough, but mentally resilient. Men who can think independently, adapt to chaos, and operate behind enemy lines without support. The training is brutal. Commandos are taught to march 30 miles carrying full equipment, to climb cliffs in darkness, to kill silently with knife and garrote, to handle explosives, to navigate by stars. They learn unarmed combat from experts in jiu-jitsu and boxing. They practice amphibious landings until they can do them in their sleep. They're trained in Scotland, in conditions that simulate the harsh environments they'll face in occupied Europe. The washout rate is high. Not everyone has what it takes to be a commando. The physical demands alone eliminate half the volunteers. The psychological pressure eliminates more. Those who make it through become part of an elite brotherhood. They wear the green beret with pride. They know they're being trained for missions that conventional soldiers couldn't attempt. And they know that capture likely means death, because the Germans don't look kindly on raiders who strike from the sea and disappear into the night. By December 1941, the commandos have conducted several small raids on targets in France, the Channel Islands, and Norway. Some have been successful, destroying German installations and capturing prisoners. Others have been disasters, with men killed or captured. But they've proven the concept. Small, highly trained units can strike targets that conventional forces can't reach. They can tie down German troops who have to guard every mile of coastline. They can gather intelligence. And most importantly, they can show the occupied populations of Europe that Britain hasn't given up. Churchill wants something bigger, something that will make headlines around the world, something that will terrify the Germans and inspire the occupied populations of Europe. Something that will prove the commandos aren't just a propaganda stunt, but a genuine military capability. The target chosen is Vågsøy and Måløy, two small towns on the Norwegian coast about 200 miles north of Bergen. The operation is codenamed Archery, and its objectives are clear. Destroy fish oil factories that supply glycerin for German explosives, sink any German shipping in the harbor, capture prisoners for intelligence purposes, and prove that British forces can strike anywhere along Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The planning is meticulous. Intelligence officers study reconnaissance photographs. Naval officers calculate tide tables and approach routes. Commando officers rehearse the assault on similar terrain in Scotland. Every detail is considered, every contingency planned for. The men know their objectives, their routes, their rally points. They know what to do if things go wrong. But what nobody knows yet is that this raid will trigger a response from Hitler that will change the rules of warfare itself and create a moral crisis for German officers who still believed in the old codes of military honor. December 27th, 1941, 08:48 hours. The Norwegian coast. Commander John Durnford Slater crouches in the landing craft as it approaches the shore. Around him, 51 men of No. 3 Commando check their weapons one final time. The sea is rough, waves crashing against the hull. The morning is dark, the sun not yet risen this far north in late December. Ahead of them lies a German-occupied town that has no idea what's about to hit it. Durnford Slater is 29 years old, a regular Army officer who volunteered for the commandos because he was bored with garrison duty. He wanted action, wanted to prove himself. Now, as the landing craft pitches in the heavy seas, he wonders if he's about to get more action than he bargained for. This is the biggest commando operation yet, involving over 500 men, naval support from the cruiser HMS Kenya and 4 destroyers, and air cover from RAF fighters. The plan is precise. While Durnford Slater's men assault Vågsøy town, another group under Captain Peter Young will take the island of Måløy, where the Germans have a coastal battery. Naval gunfire will provide support, suppressing German positions and destroying key targets. RAF bombers and fighters will keep the Luftwaffe away and provide additional firepower. They have exactly 4 hours to complete their mission before German reinforcements arrive from Bergen. 4 hours to get in, destroy the targets, and get out. At 08:48, HMS Kenya opens fire. The naval bombardment is devastating, 6-inch shells screaming overhead to explode among the German positions. Buildings disintegrate in clouds of brick dust and smoke. The coastal battery on Måløy disappears in a series of massive explosions. Smoke and dust fill the air, reducing visibility to almost nothing. 60 seconds later, the landing craft hit the beach. What happens next is chaos. Brutal, close-quarters combat through the streets of a small Norwegian town. The Germans, caught completely by surprise, fight back desperately. The garrison consists of about 150 men from the 181st Infantry Division, supplemented by Kriegsmarine personnel from the ships in harbor and Luftwaffe ground crew from a nearby airfield. They're not elite troops, but they're soldiers, and they fight with the desperation of men who know they're outnumbered and outgunned. The commandos move through buildings, clearing rooms with grenades and submachine gun fire. The training takes over. Teams move in coordinated rushes, covering each other, communicating with hand signals when the noise makes shouting useless. They've practiced this 100 times in Scotland, but this is different. This is real. The bullets are real. The blood is real. The screams are real. Private George Herbert later described it. It wasn't like the training. It was louder, more confused. You couldn't think, you just reacted. The smell, the noise, the way time seems to slow down and speed up at the same time. You see your mate go down and you keep moving because that's what you're trained to do. You don't have time to think about it. You just move, shoot, move again. It's like being in a nightmare, except you're awake and it's all real. The fighting is savage. House to house, room to room, the Germans recover from their initial shock and begin to organize resistance. Machine gun positions have to be taken with grenades and bayonets. Snipers fire from windows, forcing the commandos to move carefully, checking every angle. A German officer rallies his men and launches a counterattack down the main street. The commandos take casualties, but they keep moving forward, their momentum carrying them through the German defenses. Captain Martin Linge, a Norwegian officer fighting with the British, leads his men against a German strongpoint in a warehouse. He's 44 years old, an actor in civilian life, one of the first Norwegians to join the resistance after his country was invaded. He's fought in several raids already, always volunteering for the most dangerous missions. A German machine gun opens fire from a second-story window. Linge is hit multiple times in the chest. He dies within minutes, becoming one of Norway's most celebrated war heroes. The Norwegian Special Forces will later be named the Linge Company in his honor. The battle rages for hours. The fish oil factories are set ablaze, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, the smoke visible for miles. German ships in the harbor are sunk by demolition charges. The commandos fight their way through the town, clearing buildings, destroying equipment, gathering documents. Norwegian civilians watch from windows, some cheering, others terrified. Some Norwegian volunteers join the commandos, choosing to evacuate to Britain rather than remain under German occupation. By midday, the objectives are achieved. The fish oil factories are burning, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air. German ships are sinking in the harbor, their crews abandoning ship. Over 150 Germans are dead or captured. The commandos have seized valuable intelligence documents, including code books and operational orders. Norwegian volunteers are being evacuated to Britain, where they'll join the Free Norwegian Forces. But the commandos have paid a price too. 17 dead, 53 wounded. And the withdrawal is becoming chaotic. German reinforcements are approaching from the north and south. Luftwaffe aircraft are attacking despite the RAF fighter cover. The landing craft are taking fire from German positions that weren't cleared. The sea is getting rougher, making the evacuation more difficult. And then comes the moment that changes everything. As the commandos begin to withdraw, several wounded men are left behind. Some are too badly injured to move, lying in buildings where they fell. Others are cut off by German counterattacks, unable to reach the evacuation beaches. In the confusion of the evacuation, in the smoke and noise and chaos, they're left on Norwegian soil. It's not intentional. The commandos never abandon their wounded deliberately. But in the fog of war, mistakes happen. Men get separated. Communications break down. And when the landing craft pull away, some men are still ashore. Among those left behind is Trooper John Fairclough, shot through both legs during the assault on a German machine gun position. There's Lieutenant Patrick O'Flaherty, concussed by a grenade blast, found unconscious in a building. Corporal Thomas Archer, separated from his unit during the fighting, hiding in a warehouse, and several others, scattered through the town, unable to reach the evacuation beaches before the landing craft departed. As the landing craft pull away, these men face capture. Under normal circumstances, that would mean becoming prisoners of war, protected by the Geneva Convention. Medical treatment for their wounds, then transfer to a POW camp somewhere in Germany or occupied Europe. Uncomfortable, certainly. Years of captivity, poor food, boredom, separation from family, but alive, with a chance to survive the war and go home. But these aren't normal circumstances, because Adolf Hitler is about to issue an order that will turn captured commandos into dead men. The news of the WWII raid reaches Hitler's headquarters within hours. His reaction is volcanic. Witnesses describe him as nearly incoherent with rage, pacing back and forth in his office, shouting about British terrorism and the need for ruthless retaliation. He pounds his fist on the table. He demands to know how the British were able to strike so deep into occupied territory. He wants heads to roll. Hitler has always been paranoid about Norway. He believes the British might try to invade and cut off Germany's iron ore supplies from Sweden, which come through the Norwegian port of Narvik. Every British raid on Norway confirms his worst fears. He's convinced that Norway is the zone of destiny where the war might be decided. He's ordered massive resources devoted to defending Norway, far more than the strategic situation warrants. Entire divisions that could be fighting on the Eastern Front are instead garrisoning Norwegian fjords. But this raid is different. This raid was too successful, too bold, too humiliating. The Germans had been caught completely by surprise. Their coastal defenses had been overwhelmed in minutes. The British had destroyed valuable facilities, killed German soldiers, and simply sailed away, leaving destruction in their wake. And they'd done it in broad daylight, with naval and air support, as if they owned the Norwegian coast. Hitler sees it as a personal insult. He's built the Atlantic Wall, fortified the entire coast of occupied Europe, and the British are treating it like it doesn't exist. They're raiding wherever they want, whenever they want, and Hitler can't stand it. Over the following months, as more commando raids hit targets across occupied Europe, Hitler's obsession grows. In March 1942, commandos raid the French port of Saint-Nazaire, destroying Germany's only Atlantic coast facility capable of servicing the battleship Tirpitz. The raid is a suicide mission, with most of the commandos killed or captured, but it achieves its objective. The dock is destroyed, forcing the Tirpitz to remain in Norwegian waters, where it's less of a threat to Atlantic convoys. In August 1942, commandos participate in the disastrous Dieppe raid, a large-scale assault on the French port that ends in catastrophe. Thousands of Canadian and British troops are killed or captured. But even this disaster shows Hitler that the Allies are willing to take enormous risks to strike at occupied Europe. Each raid feeds Hitler's paranoia. He becomes convinced that the commandos represent a new kind of warfare, one that ignores the traditional rules. He sees them not as soldiers, but as terrorists, criminals who deserve no protection under international law. He rants about how they strike from the darkness, kill German soldiers, and disappear. How they don't fight fair, don't follow the rules. How they're not real soldiers but assassins and saboteurs. On October 18, 1942, nearly a year after Operation Archery, Hitler issues the Commando Befehl, the Commando Order. It's one of the most infamous orders of the war, and it's explicit in its brutality. The order states, "From now on, all enemies on so-called commando missions in Europe or Africa challenged by German troops, even if they are to all appearances soldiers in uniform or demolition troops, whether armed or unarmed, in battle or in flight, are to be slaughtered to the last man. The order continues. If individual members of such commandos fall into the hands of the Wehrmacht by some other means, they are to be handed over immediately to the SD. Any imprisonment under military guard is strictly prohibited, even if this is only intended for a short time. The order goes on to specify that even if commandos surrender, even if they're wounded, even if they're clearly soldiers in uniform, they're to be executed. No trials, no appeals, no mercy, just immediate execution. This isn't a military order, it's a murder directive, and it puts every Wehrmacht officer who receives it in an impossible position. Because many Wehrmacht officers, especially the older generation, still believed in something the Nazis despised: military honor. The idea that soldiers, even enemy soldiers, deserved to be treated according to the laws of war, that there were rules, even in combat, that some things were simply not done, that prisoners were to be treated humanely, that wounded enemies were to be given medical care, that soldiers in uniform were entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. These officers had been raised in the tradition of the Prussian military, which, despite its reputation for harsh discipline, had a strong code of honor. Officers were expected to be brave, but also honorable, to treat prisoners decently, to respect the laws of war, to maintain standards of conduct even in the chaos of combat. An officer's word was his bond. An officer protected those under his authority, even if they were enemy prisoners. The commando order violates all of this. It orders soldiers to commit murder. It explicitly overrides the Geneva Convention. It turns the Wehrmacht into an instrument of terror, no different from the SS death squads operating on the Eastern Front. The order creates an immediate divide. The SS, Hitler's ideological fanatics, embrace it enthusiastically. For them, it's simply an extension of the racial war they're already fighting on the Eastern Front, where Soviet prisoners are routinely murdered, where entire villages are burned, where the rules of civilized warfare have been abandoned. The commando order fits perfectly with their worldview. The enemy deserves no mercy. Victory justifies any method. Weakness is contemptible. But many Wehrmacht officers are horrified. They're being ordered to commit what they know is murder. Some protest to their superiors. Most are overruled. A few find ways to resist, to delay, to create bureaucratic obstacles that prevent the order from being implemented. And in Norway, where commando raids continue throughout 1942 and 1943, this divide becomes a matter of life and death. Let me introduce you to the man at the center of our story, Oberst Heinrich Windisch, commander of the 349th Infantry Regiment, stationed near Trondheim, Norway. Windisch is 47 years old in 1942. He's a career officer who joined the German Army in 1914, just in time to fight in World War I. He spent 4 years in the trenches, was wounded twice, earned the Iron Cross First and Second Class. He saw the worst that war could offer: the mud and blood of the Somme, the gas attacks at Ypres, the senseless slaughter of trench warfare where thousands died for a few yards of ground. He remembers the Christmas truce of 1914, when German and British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and met in no man's land, exchanging cigarettes and chocolate, playing football, singing carols. He remembers how the officers on both sides tried to stop it, but the men did it anyway, recognizing their common humanity despite being enemies. He remembers thinking that if soldiers could do that, could recognize each other as human beings even in the midst of war, then maybe there was hope for civilization. After the war, he stayed in the military through the chaos of the Weimar Republic. He's not a Nazi. He never joined the party. When asked, he would say he's a soldier, not a politician. He believes in Germany, certainly, but his loyalty is to the army. to the institution, to the code of honor that defines what it means to be an officer. He's uncomfortable with the Nazis, with their crude ideology, their contempt for traditional values, their glorification of violence. But he's a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. That's what he tells himself. He's married with 2 children. His son Klaus is serving on the Eastern Front as a lieutenant in a panzer regiment. His daughter Anna is studying medicine in Berlin, hoping to become a doctor. He writes to them regularly, careful letters that avoid discussing the war, but convey his love and his hope that they'll all survive to see peace. He worries about Klaus, knowing what's happening on the Eastern Front. He worries about Anna, knowing that Berlin is being bombed regularly by the RAF. Windisch is not a hero in the traditional sense. He's not particularly brave or brilliant. He's a competent officer, well regarded by his men, respected by his superiors. He does his job. He follows orders. He maintains discipline. He takes care of his soldiers. He's exactly the kind of solid professional officer that any army needs. The kind of officer who keeps things running, who makes sure supplies arrive, who handles the 1,000 administrative details that keep a regiment functioning. But he's about to face a test that will define his character and his legacy. When the Commando order reaches his headquarters in November 1942, Windisch reads it 3 times. Then he sits at his desk for a long time, staring at the document. He reads it again, hoping he's misunderstood. But the language is clear. Captured commandos are to be executed. No exceptions. No trials. Just murder. Finally, he calls in his adjutant, Hauptmann Friedrich Müller. Müller is 32, a lawyer in civilian life, called up when the war started. He's efficient, intelligent, loyal. Windisch trusts him. "Have you seen this?" Windisch asks, handing over the order. Müller reads it, his face growing pale. "Mein Gott," he whispers. "Exactly," Windisch says. "This is a murder order. If we implement this, we're no better than criminals." "But it comes from the Führer himself," Müller protests. "We can't simply ignore it." Windisch looks at his adjutant for a long moment. "Can't we?" he asks quietly. Müller stares at him. "Sir, if we ignore this, if the SS finds out, we'll be arrested, court-martialed, probably shot." "I know," Windisch says. "But I will not murder prisoners. I will not order my men to become murderers. We're soldiers, not executioners." "But sir—" "Friedrich," Windisch interrupts. "I fought in the last war. I saw what happened when we abandoned the rules of civilized warfare. I saw the gas attacks, the flamethrowers, the deliberate targeting of civilians. And I swore that if I ever had the chance, I would never participate in that kind of barbarism again. This order is barbarism, and I will not implement it. What happens next is an act of quiet defiance that could get both men shot." Windisch locks the order in his safe and tells his staff officers that it was never received, that it must have been lost in transit. He instructs Müller to make no record of it in the regimental log. As far as official records are concerned, the 349th Infantry Regiment never received the Commando order. It's a dangerous game. The SS is watching. They have representatives attached to every major Wehrmacht unit, ostensibly as liaisons, but really as political officers, ensuring ideological compliance. If they discover what Windisch has done, he'll be arrested, court-martialed, probably executed for treason. But Windisch isn't alone. Across occupied Europe, Wehrmacht officers are making similar decisions, finding ways to misunderstand or not receive Hitler's murder directive. Some classify captured commandos as regular infantry. Others claim they're downed aircrew, which puts them under Luftwaffe jurisdiction, and the Luftwaffe is less enthusiastic about executing prisoners. Still others simply delay implementation, creating bureaucratic obstacles that allow prisoners to disappear into the regular POW system before the SS can get their hands on them. It's a form of resistance that's easy to miss because it's quiet, administrative, hidden in paperwork. There are no dramatic confrontations, no heroic speeches. Just officers quietly filing reports that misclassify prisoners, or losing paperwork, or claiming they never received certain orders. But it saves lives, and it puts these officers at enormous risk. March 1943. Another commando raid hits the Norwegian coast, this time targeting a hydroelectric plant that supplies power to German installations. The raid is partially successful, but during the withdrawal, 4 commandos are captured by a patrol from Windish's regiment. The men are wounded, exhausted, and expect to be treated as prisoners of war. They're soldiers in uniform, carrying military identification. Under the Geneva Convention, they're entitled to medical treatment and humane detention. Instead, they're brought to Windish's headquarters, where the Oberst faces the decision that will define his character. The 4 men are brought into his office under guard. Windisch looks at them carefully. They're young, probably early 20s. One has a bandage around his head, blood seeping through. Another can barely stand, leaning on his comrades for support. They're frightened, trying not to show it, standing at attention despite their wounds. "Do any of you speak German?" Windisch asks. One of them, a corporal, steps forward. "A little, sir," he says in heavily accented German. "You are British commandos?" Windisch asks. The corporal hesitates, then nods. "Yes, sir. We are soldiers of His Majesty's forces." Windisch nods slowly. He knows what he's supposed to do. The commando order is explicit. These men are to be executed immediately. No trial, no appeal, no mercy. Just take them outside and shoot them. But he also knows what the right thing to do is. These are soldiers. They're in uniform. They're wounded. They deserve to be treated as prisoners of war. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," Windisch says. "Your wounds will be treated. You will be given food and water. You will be held as prisoners of war." The corporal looks surprised. "Thank you, sir," he says. Windisch orders them taken to the regimental aid station. He tells the medical officer to treat their wounds. He orders guards posted, but tells them the prisoners are to be treated humanely. Within hours, an SS officer arrives. Sturmbannführer Klaus Becker, Gestapo, attached to the SS security apparatus in Norway. He's young, probably 30, with the hard eyes and cruel mouth of a true believer. He wears the death's head insignia of the SS with obvious pride. He carries a copy of the commando order. "I understand you have captured British terrorists," Becker announces without preamble, walking into Windisch's office without knocking. "I have captured 4 British soldiers," Windisch corrects carefully, not standing up. Becker's eyes narrow. "Commandos are not soldiers. They are terrorists. The Führer's orders are explicit. They are to be executed immediately." Windisch stands up slowly, using his height advantage. He's a tall man, over 6 feet, and he towers over Becker. "These men are soldiers in uniform. They were conducting a military operation. They are entitled to treatment as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention." Becker's face hardens. "The Führer's orders supersede the Geneva Convention. These men are terrorists. They will be shot within the hour." What happens next is documented in post-war testimony from multiple sources, including Hauptmann Müller, who was present in the room. Windisch walks to his office door and opens it. "Get out," he tells Becker. The SS officer is stunned. "What did you say?" "I said, get out. These men are my prisoners. They are under Wehrmacht custody. They will be treated according to the conventions of war. If you have a problem with that, take it up with my commanding officer." Becker's face turns red. You're refusing a direct order from the Führer? I'm following military law, Windisch replies. These men are prisoners of war. I will not murder prisoners. Now get out of my office. It's an extraordinary moment. A Wehrmacht colonel directly defying an SS officer, directly refusing to carry out Hitler's orders. For a Wehrmacht officer to defy the SS is almost unthinkable. The SS has enormous power. They can arrest anyone, investigate anyone, execute anyone they deem a traitor. And Windisch has just told an SS officer to get out of his office. Becker leaves, furious, promising that this isn't over, that Windisch will answer for this insubordination, that he'll report this to his superiors. And Windisch knows he's just signed his own death warrant, unless he can find a way out. After Becker leaves, Windisch sits at his desk for a long time, thinking. Miller stands nearby, pale and frightened. Sir, what are we going to do? Miller asks. The SS will report this. They'll send someone from Berlin. You'll be arrested. Windisch looks up. Then we need to make sure there's nothing to report. I don't understand. The prisoners, Windisch says slowly. They need to escape. Miller stares at him. Escape? Sir, we'd be court-martialed. They'd shoot us. Not if it's done properly, Windisch says. Not if it looks like they overpowered their guards. Not if it looks like a security failure rather than deliberate. But sir, Friedrich, Windisch interrupts, using his adjutant's first name. I will not murder prisoners. I will not turn these men over to the SS to be shot. If that makes me a traitor, so be it. Now, are you with me or not? Miller is silent for a long moment. He thinks about his wife and children back in Germany. He thinks about what will happen if they're caught. But he also thinks about what kind of man he wants to be. What kind of officer? What kind of human being? I'm with you, sir, he says finally. That night, Windisch arranges for the 4 British commandos to escape. The details are murky, deliberately so. Post-war accounts from the surviving commandos describe being moved to a less secure building on the edge of the base. Guards who seemed unusually inattentive, who looked the other way at crucial moments. A door left unlocked. A Norwegian civilian who appeared with a map and directions to the Swedish border, which is only about 100 miles away. Sergeant James McLeod later testified. We thought it was a trap at first. Why would the Germans make it so easy? But our guard looked at us and said in broken English, Go now, before SS comes. Sweden that way. He pointed east. We went. We walked for 3 days, hiding during the day, moving at night. We crossed into Sweden and eventually made it back to Britain. All 4 men reached Sweden and eventually made it back to Britain. They reported that a German officer had deliberately facilitated their escape, but they didn't know his name. British intelligence filed the report, noting it as an interesting anomaly but not investigating further. There were more pressing matters to deal with. When the escape is discovered the next morning, Windisch reports it as a security failure. He claims the prisoners overpowered their guards, knocked them unconscious, and escaped. He orders an investigation, which conveniently finds that the guards were negligent but not criminally so. They're punished with extra duties and loss of leave, but nothing more serious. Becker is furious. He knows what really happened, but he can't prove it. And without proof, even the SS has to follow procedures. He files a report with his superiors, but without evidence, it goes nowhere. But Windisch knows he's being watched now. Any further defiance will be his last. And yet, when the next commando raid comes, Windisch makes the same choice. Over the following year, Windisch's regiment captures 3 more groups of British commandos. Each time, Windisch finds a way to protect them. He classifies them as regular infantry, claiming they were captured in circumstances that don't fit the commando order's criteria. He creates paperwork showing they were part of a conventional military operation. He delays their transfer to SS custody, giving them time to escape or be transferred to regular POW camps before the SS can intervene. And twice more, he arranges escapes. By the time the war ends, Windisch has saved at least 23 British and Norwegian commandos from execution. But Windisch isn't the only Wehrmacht officer making these choices. Let me tell you about some of the others, because this pattern of resistance is more widespread than most people realize. In France, General Major Eugen Meindl, commander of the 2nd Parachute Corps, receives captured British paratroopers after a raid on a German radar station. The SS demands they be turned over for execution under the commando order. Meindl refuses, classifying them as regular airborne infantry rather than commandos. When the SS protests, Meindl threatens to resign his command. The matter goes to Field Marshal Kesselring, who backs Meindl. The prisoners are sent to regular POW camps. Meindl's defiance is documented in his post-war testimony at Nuremberg. In Italy, Generaloberst Heinrich von Wiedinghoff issues orders that captured Allied special forces are to be treated as prisoners of war, pending clarification of their status. It's a bureaucratic delay tactic that saves dozens of lives. By the time the clarification comes through, the prisoners have been transferred to POW camps where the SS can't reach them. In Norway itself, several other Wehrmacht commanders find creative ways to avoid implementing the commando order. Some claim captured raiders are downed aircrew, which puts them under Luftwaffe jurisdiction. Others argue they're regular infantry who happened to arrive by boat. Still others simply lose the paperwork, claiming administrative confusion. These aren't isolated incidents. They represent a pattern of resistance within the Wehrmacht, a quiet refusal to implement what many officers recognize as a criminal order. But the SS is determined to enforce Hitler's will, and the conflict between Wehrmacht honor and SS ideology explodes into open confrontation. October 1943, Operation Freshman, a British glider-borne raid on the Vemork heavy water plant in Norway, ends in disaster. Both gliders crash in the mountains. Survivors are captured by Wehrmacht mountain troops under General Major Kurt Student. Student is a legendary figure, the father of German airborne forces, the man who planned the airborne invasion of Crete. He's also an officer of the old school, a man who believes in military honor. He orders the captured British soldiers to be treated as POWs, given medical treatment for their injuries from the crashes. But the Gestapo intervenes. An SS officer arrives with the commando order and demands the prisoners be turned over immediately. Student refuses. A standoff develops, with Wehrmacht guards preventing SS personnel from taking the prisoners. The matter is escalated to Berlin. The decision comes down from Hitler himself. The commando order applies. The prisoners are to be turned over to the SS immediately. Student has no choice. He's a soldier. He follows orders. But he makes sure the transfer is documented, that there's a clear paper trail showing he protested, that he argued for the prisoners to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The prisoners are taken from Wehrmacht custody and executed by the SS. When Student learns what happened, he's furious. The men weren't just executed. They were tortured first, interrogated brutally, then shot. Student files an official protest with the Wehrmacht High Command. It goes nowhere, but it's documented. After the war, that documentation helps Student avoid prosecution for war crimes. The conflict reaches its peak in 1944, when the Allies invade Normandy. Wehrmacht commanders are under enormous pressure from the SS to execute captured raiders, but many continue to resist. Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in France, issues his own interpretation of the Commando order. Captured enemy soldiers in uniform are to be treated as POWs unless they're caught in civilian clothes or engaged in sabotage. It's a narrow interpretation that saves lives. Rommel is already involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler, and his defiance of the Commando order is part of his growing disillusionment with the Nazi regime. After the war, Allied investigators discovered Wehrmacht files that had been hidden from the SS, documenting cases where captured commandos had been protected. These files were hidden in false-bottomed filing cabinets, buried in administrative buildings, smuggled out of Germany by officers who knew they might be needed as evidence someday. One file, discovered in 1947 in Trondheim, contained a note from Windisch dated April 1943. 4 enemy soldiers captured during raid, classified as regular infantry per Geneva Convention, transferred to Stalag custody. It was a lie. Those 4 soldiers were commandos. But by lying in an official document, Windisch created a paper trail that protected them. And then he arranged for them to escape before they reached the Stalag. The file also contained a personal letter from Windisch to his wife. Never sent. I have done something today that may cost me my life, but I could not do otherwise. I am a soldier, not a murderer. If I must die for this, at least I will die with my honor intact. Tell Klaus and Anna that I love them, and that I hope they will understand why I did what I did. The question we have to ask is, why? Why would these German officers risk everything to save enemy soldiers? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of military honor and the limits of obedience. For officers like Windisch, Meindl, and Student, there was something more important than following orders. There was a code, inherited from centuries of European military tradition, that said soldiers owed each other certain basic standards of conduct. That even in war, there were rules. That honor mattered more than victory. That some things were simply not done, regardless of orders. This code had deep roots. It went back to medieval chivalry, to the idea that knights owed each other respect even when they were enemies. It had been refined through centuries of professional military development, codified in the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions. For these officers, this code wasn't abstract theory. It was part of their identity, part of what made them officers, rather than just men with guns. The Nazis hated this code. They saw it as weakness, as outdated sentimentality that had no place in modern total war. Hitler frequently ranted about outdated concepts of military honor, arguing that modern war required ruthlessness, that victory justified any method, that the enemy deserved no mercy. The SS represented a new kind of soldier, one who followed orders without question, who saw the enemy as subhuman, who believed victory justified any method. The SS had no code of honor beyond loyalty to Hitler. They were ideological warriors, fighting a racial war where the normal rules didn't apply. The conflict between Wehrmacht and SS wasn't just about captured commandos. It was about 2 fundamentally different visions of what a soldier should be. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Both sides committed atrocities. The Wehrmacht wasn't innocent. Many Wehrmacht units participated in war crimes, especially on the Eastern Front. Wehrmacht soldiers helped round up Jews for execution. Wehrmacht units burned villages and executed civilians. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht is exactly that. A myth created after the war to absolve German soldiers of responsibility. But within that complex reality, there were individual officers who drew lines, who said, "This far and no further," who risked everything to maintain some shred of honor in a dishonorable war. Windisch was one of them. And his story matters because it shows that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals can choose to do the right thing. But what happened to Windisch? Did his defiance catch up with him? April 1944. Windisch is summoned to Oslo to meet with SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Radies, the higher SS and police leader for Norway. Radies is one of the most powerful men in occupied Norway, responsible for implementing Nazi policies, hunting resistance fighters, and ensuring ideological compliance. The meeting takes place in Radies's office, a grand room in a requisitioned government building. Radies sits behind a massive desk. Windisch stands at attention in front of it. Radies is blunt. There are reports that you have failed to implement the Führer's orders regarding captured terrorists. There are reports that prisoners have escaped from your custody with suspicious frequency. These are serious allegations, Oberst. Windisch knows he's in mortal danger. But he also knows that Radies needs him. The military situation is deteriorating. The Eastern Front is collapsing. The Allies have landed in Italy. Experienced combat officers are in short supply. Windisch is a competent commander with a good record. Replacing him would be difficult. I have implemented all orders to the best of my ability, Windisch says carefully. If prisoners escaped, it was due to guard incompetence. I cannot be held responsible for every security failure. I have punished the guards responsible. It's a masterful deflection. He's blaming unnamed subordinates, making it sound administrative rather than ideological. And he's reminding Radies that he's valuable, that his regiment is well run and effective. Radies stares at him for a long moment. See that it doesn't happen again? He says finally. Windisch has survived. Barely. But he knows he's being watched now. The SS has its eye on him. Any further defiance will be his last. And yet, when the next Commando raid comes in June 1944, Windisch makes the same choice. 2 British soldiers are captured during a raid on a coastal radar station. Windisch classifies them as downed aircrew, claiming they parachuted from a damaged aircraft. The men are sent to a Luftwaffe POW camp, where they survive the war. It's his last act of defiance, because by this point the war is clearly lost. The Allies have landed in Normandy. The Eastern Front is collapsing. Soviet armies are driving toward Germany. It's only a matter of time before Germany is defeated. In letters to his wife, Windisch writes about his hopes for the post-war world, about seeing his children again, about returning to a normal life. He never mentions the commandos he saved. But he does write this in August 1944. I have tried to do my duty as I understand it. I have tried to be a soldier, not a murderer. Whatever happens, I hope my children will understand that I did what I believed was right. I hope they will not be ashamed of their father. May 1945. Germany has surrendered. The war is over. But in Norway, chaos reigns as German forces try to surrender, while Norwegian resistance fighters seek revenge for 5 years of occupation. Windisch is preparing to surrender his regiment to British forces when he's arrested by Norwegian resistance fighters. They don't know about the commandos he saved. They only know he's a German officer, part of the occupation force that has oppressed their country for 5 years. On May 12, 1945, 5 days after the German surrender, Heinrich Windisch is executed by Norwegian partisans. He's 50 years old. He's given no trial, no chance to explain what he did, no opportunity to tell them about the men he saved. He's simply shot and buried in an unmarked grave in the Norwegian countryside. It's a bitter irony. The man who risked everything to save Allied soldiers is killed by Allied forces who don't know what he did. But his story doesn't end there. In 1947, British investigators tracking down war crimes related to the Commando order discover Windisch's files in a storage facility in Trondheim. They interview the commandos he saved. They piece together what he did, how he defied the SS, how he saved lives at enormous personal risk. Sergeant James MacLeod, one of the 4 men who escaped in 1943, is tracked down in Scotland. When investigators tell him that Windisch was executed by Norwegian partisans, MacLeod breaks down in tears. "That man saved my life," MacLeod says. "He risked everything to let us go, and we killed him without even knowing who he was. God forgive us." The investigators interview other survivors. All tell similar stories of a German officer who found ways to protect them, who defied SS orders, who maintained his honor even when it meant risking his life. In 1949, the British government issues a posthumous commendation recognizing Windisch's actions. Several of the commandos he saved attend a memorial service in Trondheim, where a plaque is unveiled honoring his memory. Sergeant James MacLeod speaks at the service. "This man was our enemy, but he was also a soldier who understood that some things are more important than following orders. He saved my life and the lives of many others. I will never forget him. I named my son after him so that his memory will live on." MacLeod keeps that promise. He spends the rest of his life documenting Windisch's story, writing letters to historians, giving interviews. When MacLeod dies in 1989, his obituary mentions Windisch, describing him as the German officer who taught me that honor transcends nationality. The story of Heinrich Windisch and officers like him raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember World War II. We like our history simple: good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains. But real history is messier. Real people are more complex. This doesn't excuse the crimes of Nazi Germany. The Holocaust, the war of aggression, the millions of deaths, these are historical facts that cannot be minimized. Nazi Germany was an evil regime that had to be defeated. But it does mean that we need to recognize that within the German military, there were men who resisted, who drew lines, who refused to become murderers. Not many, certainly. Not enough to change the outcome. But enough to show that even in a totalitarian system, individual moral courage is possible. The conflict between Wehrmacht and SS over the Commando order saved lives. It created space for resistance. It showed that not everyone was a fanatic, that not everyone blindly followed orders. After the war, this divide became legally significant. Several Wehrmacht officers used their resistance to the Commando order as evidence of their character during war crimes trials. Some of these defenses were accepted. Others were not. The legal and moral questions are complex. Can you claim credit for refusing one type of war crime while participating in others? Does saving some lives excuse failing to save others? These are questions without easy answers. But what's clear is that officers like Windisch made choices, often at great personal risk, to save lives. And those choices matter. They show that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals retain moral agency, that following orders is not an excuse for murder, that honor and decency can survive even in the midst of total war. Let me tell you about some of the commandos who survived because of these choices. Sergeant James MacLeod returned to Britain, participated in D-Day, survived the war, and returned to Scotland. He married, had 3 children, worked as a schoolteacher. He named his first son Heinrich, after the German officer who saved his life. When people asked about the unusual name, he told them the story. He wanted people to know that even in war, humanity can survive. Lieutenant Patrick O'Flaherty wasn't so lucky. He was captured again in 1944 during a raid in France. This time, the Wehrmacht officer wasn't like Windisch. O'Flaherty was turned over to the SS and executed. He was 23 years old. His family didn't learn what happened to him until after the war, when investigators pieced together his fate from German records. Corporal Thomas Archer survived the war in a POW camp. He became a historian after the war, documenting the stories of Wehrmacht officers who had saved commandos. He wrote a book in 1967 titled The Honorable Enemy, which told the stories of Windisch and others like him. The book was controversial, with some critics arguing that it was too sympathetic to German officers. But Archer insisted that the truth was complex, that not all Germans were monsters, that individual acts of courage and decency deserved to be remembered. These men understood something important, that even in war, individual choices matter. That honor isn't about which side you're on, it's about how you conduct yourself, that the enemy is still human, still deserving of basic decency. But not all commandos were fortunate. The commando order resulted in the execution of dozens, possibly hundreds, of captured British raiders. We know of specific cases. 12 commandos executed after a raid on Sark in the Channel Islands. 6 executed in Norway after various raids. 34 SAS members executed in France after being captured behind enemy lines. These are documented cases, with names and dates. But there were others who simply disappeared, whose fates were never determined. After the war, families waited for news that never came. Some men were listed as missing in action, their bodies never found, their final moments unknown. After the war, Allied investigators prosecuted German officers who had implemented the commando order. Several were executed for war crimes at Nuremberg and other trials. Others received long prison sentences. The commando order itself was declared a war crime, a violation of the Geneva Convention. But the officers who had resisted the order were recognized and honored. Their stories became part of the historical record, evidence that even in the darkest times, individual moral courage is possible. So what's the lesson here? What can we learn from this story? First, that moral courage exists even in the darkest circumstances. Officers like Windisch could have followed orders. It would have been easier, safer. But they chose to risk everything to do what they believed was right. They showed that individuals retain moral agency even in totalitarian systems, even when following orders would be the safe choice. Second, that institutional culture matters. The Wehrmacht's traditional officer code created space for individual officers to resist Nazi ideology. It provided a framework that allowed men like Windisch to justify their defiance, to say, "This violates military honor," and have that mean something. The SS had no such framework. The SS was built on absolute obedience, on ideological purity. There was no space for individual conscience. Third, that we need to be careful about how we remember history. Simple narratives are comforting, but they're often wrong. The truth is usually more complex, more nuanced, more human. The story of the commando order and the Wehrmacht officers who resisted it doesn't change the fundamental truth that Nazi Germany was evil, but it does show that within that evil system, there were individuals who tried to maintain their humanity, who refused to become murderers, who risked everything to do the right thing. And that matters. Because if we only remember the monsters, we miss the lesson that ordinary people can choose to do extraordinary things. We miss the lesson that moral courage is possible even in impossible circumstances. Let me end with one more story. Sergeant James MacLeod, now 67 years old, receives a letter from Germany. It's from Margarete Windisch, Heinrich Windisch's daughter, who has been researching her father's war service. She's discovered that her father saved British soldiers, but she doesn't know the details. She's asking if MacLeod can tell her what happened, if he can help her understand what her father did. MacLeod writes back immediately. He tells her everything: how her father defied the SS, how he arranged the escape, how he saved MacLeod's life and the lives of many others, how he risked everything to maintain his honor. Your father was a brave man, MacLeod writes. He was my enemy, but he was also a man of honor. He showed me that even in war, humanity can survive. I have thought of him often over the years. Your father saved my life. I named my son after him. I will never forget him. You should be proud of what he did. Margaret Vindish writes back, thanking MacLeod. She includes a photograph of her father in uniform taken in 1943. It shows a tall man with a serious face, wearing the Iron Cross, looking directly at the camera. MacLeod keeps that photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. When he dies in 1989, his family finds it there, along with a note. Oberst Heinrich Windisch, the German officer who taught me that honor transcends nationality. Never forget. That's the real lesson of this story. Not that the Germans were good, or the British were bad, but that in the midst of total war, individual human beings could still recognize each other's humanity. That honor and decency can survive even in the darkest circumstances. That individuals can choose to do the right thing even when it costs them everything. Officers like Heinrich Windisch made choices that saved lives. They risked everything to maintain a code of honor that the Nazis despised. They showed that even in a totalitarian system, individuals retain moral agency, that following orders is not an excuse for murder. And the commandos they saved never forgot. They spent the rest of their lives telling these stories, making sure that history remembered not just the atrocities, but also the acts of courage and decency. Because that's what history should do. It should show us the full complexity of human nature, the capacity for both evil and good, the choices that individuals make even when the system is monstrous. The story of Operation Archery and the raids that followed, the story of the Commando order and the Wehrmacht officers who resisted it. This is history that matters. Not because it changes our understanding of who won, but because it shows us that even in the darkest times, individual moral courage is possible. And in a world that often seems divided into irreconcilable camps, that's a lesson worth remembering. So here's my question for you. If you were in Windisch's position, knowing that defying orders could get you executed, would you have the courage to do what he did? Would you risk everything to save enemy soldiers? It's easy to say yes when you're safe at home. But what would you really do when your life was on the line? And for the veterans watching, have you ever encountered an enemy who showed you unexpected humanity? Have you ever had to make a choice between following orders and following your conscience? These are the questions that define us as human beings. Drop your thoughts in the comments. These discussions matter because they help us understand not just history, but ourselves. If this story moved you, you need to hear about the Wehrmacht officer who saved an entire French village from SS destruction. That story is even more incredible, and it shows the same moral courage in an even more impossible situation. Hit subscribe, because next week we're diving into that story, and it will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty, duty, and honor in wartime. Until then, remember that history is never as simple as we want it to be, and the most important lessons often come from the stories that don't fit our comfortable narratives. The truth is always more complex and always more human than the myths we create.